February 5th, 2439, the first Battlemech received its baptism of fire on a desolate series of steppes near the North American city of Yakima. The Battlemech, a joint effort by more than 20 of the best weapons manufacturers, I can never pronounce this word, was tested against four ancient Mechwarrior heavy tanks, specially fitted with remote control devices. The commander of the Battlemech and the first Mechwarrior was Colonel Charles Kincaid. Few people who witnessed the first combat round of the Battlemech were debriefed. What follows is a transcript of a verbal report filed by Professor Hertog Garbelman, Chief Research Scientist of Corinna's Fiber Optics Interstellar manufacturer of Battlemech sensor systems. Colonel Kincaid, with his usual impatience, rushed through the pre-test warm-up and nearly ripped apart one of his umbilical connections trying to get the test started. As I began to monitor the sensor output, I noticed the Battlemech myomer neural feedback circuits were faithfully echoing Colonel Kincaid's brainwave patterns. It was eerie, almost as though the mech was technically alive and Kincaid had sparked a divinity. The Colonel's howl of sheer pleasure quickly cleared my head of that notion. He pushed the Mackie forward in a trot straight into the test range, where four tanks awaited among the low rolling hills. One of the tanks opened fire. The shot was true and hit the mech just above the right hit. Everyone in the brightly lit bunker seemed to hold his breath as all the readouts fizzled into snow and the blast interference. No damage. A piece of steel no thicker than my finger, strengthened by radiation casting techniques, impregnated with a sheet of woven diamond fibers, has stopped cold an armor-piercing shell. That same shell would have gone straight through a third of a meter of normal steel. The tracking cameras watched as the Colonel swiveled his chest to bring his weapons to bear. 20 years of my life seemed to focus on a single action that would take no more than 5 seconds. I watched as Colonel Kincaid used his sensors, my sensor, to pick out the tank hidden among the group of small trees and bushes. He fired both his PPC and autocannon. Both shots were direct hits and the tank erupted into a ball of flame. A thunderous cheer swept the bunker, while everyone present began to slap me on the back. Instead of feeling pleased with the mech's performance, I felt increasingly sad. I didn't realize why until Kincaid began to track down the last tank. The tank operator was sitting at his remote control panel next to me. I'll never forget the expression on the young man's face. Outside, Kincaid had disabled the last tank. As he stood over it, he raised the mech's foot and brought it crashing down onto the tank. Before the Hulk had a chance to explode, Kincaid twisted the mech's foot deeper into the tank's carcass. Next to me, the operator of the tank was trying so hard not to show fear that tears were streaming down his cheeks. It hit me then that my colleagues and I had just turned loose one of the most powerful weapons ever conceived by man. And while we were celebrating like giddy children, while my companions jumped up and down with glee, that poor boy was trying to hide the fact that in the instant his screens went black, he'd wet his pants. From the Terran Hegemony document 0324-610.04, Hegemony Research and Development Department, Military Weapons Systems Division, Comstar Archives, Terra. Thus, the birth of the Battlemech, which we were seeing a vision of the first mech, actually the Mackie. This one been a slightly second generation version of the Mackie because the original was a little bit more bulky, and this one's seen some refinements, of course. The question that comes up in our Battletech universe is, why the Battlemech? Why and not tanks? And not just stay with tanks. Tanks are proven, reliable, easier to produce, less expensive, quite as capable, just as equally diverse, etc., etc. Why a walking robotic machine-based tank? Well, you have to take a couple of perspective looks and think from a little bit outside the box. Let's start with the current director of the Hegemony at the time, which was Jacob Cameron, who we're talking a combination of lots and lots and lots of government money and a massive military complex, which is typical of military complexes throughout history. Well, that's what they serve, and they exist completely for. So Jacob Cameron is dealing with a bunch of political issues. This all predates the Star League, mind you. So the Age of War is in an ebb. It comes and goes. but you have numerous great houses within the inner sphere at this point. The five most known ones and a couple secondary ones where the bigger ones hadn't quite 100% melded together. The hegemony itself, which is the core, couple hundred worlds that surround Terra at the middle of the inner sphere. This puts us in a couple of perspectives right here. The hegemony is the cutting edge of pretty much everything humanity's achieved up to this point in time, including technology, and that technology runs the gamut. The hegemony is also isolated from truly really expanding its borders any further. It is well defined and is surrounded by other houses. Thus, there's no room for it to expand unless they take that resource-rich planet or system away from one of these other houses, which, of course, the only way to really do this and achieve this is through force of arms, i.e. war. And then keeping it. Take it away from them, you got to keep it. And then that just considerably continues the cycle of death, destruction, and bloodshed, and much to the delight of the industrial war complex. The whole bread and butter is this very concept. Or to expand beyond the inner sphere into the periphery and further beyond and set up colony worlds and enclaves and things like this that's so far removed that once again they are constrained by distance and the fact that to move resources and material and what have you, you have to do so through these other houses, which not always are always on your side or conducive to you doing this. They may not like you moving large concentrations of military forces through their territory to go after something else, because there's all kinds of ramifications to this, not to mention the possibility of treachery. What if you're just free staging stuff to take something from them, for example? So this brings us back to why the Battlemech. Well, keep in mind that the Battletech universe would be considered an alternate history from our current history. Of course, things have diverged and divided and gone in different directions than what the early creators had envisioned for our particular time era. But the tank has reached its, I don't know, you can't really improve on what it is much more than it is and still be what it is. So the fact is that they have lots of money, lots of research, lots of money, lots of scientific know-how, lots of incentives to find yet another big thing that will be quite impressive to their friends and foes alike. That the inevitability of another great war machine is plausible. Is it needed? Probably not. Not necessary. But it was from a political perspective and a visual perspective. I know the term. I'm just struggling to come up with it at the top of my head. The functionalities of what this machine is capable of. The adaptability is one of the things that's always been touted about why this would be the next logical step. There's also this creative passion within the human being to mimic itself in some aspects. There's this cry for something bigger and better and bolder and faster and stronger than the previous thing. So when we look at the politics of the day of that particular year, which would have been the 2439 and the decades leading up to it, because they spent the better part of 20 years doing the research and development on the various components that lead up to the construction of the Mackie, the first Battlemech, and the actual functionality. And of course, the predecessors of these things are industrial mechs, walking machines that are more flexible and more adaptable than the current machinery. You know, forklift is a forklift, a crane is a crane is a crane. Now, if you have a forklift needs to be on a certain type of terrain or it doesn't work. Well, if we have a machine that can operate on uneven terrain and adjust its stance and move across things both hard and soft through ground clutter and things like this, it gives it a little bit more function, a little more options available to it. But the development starts out small and works its way up bigger. The same goes with the various ecologies of various worlds and environments and things like this. A tracked tank is limited to the type of terrain it can traverse, just like a wheeled tank is limited to the type of ground it can traverse. A hover tank, the same. We do not have an anti-gravity technology in the Battletech universe, so there is no such thing as anti-grav or a grav tank. You don't have a flying tank. You have really heavy-duty flying fighters and aerospace fighters. It's kind of the same reason why the aerospace fighter trumps the atmospheric fighter over time. Fact is, the atmospheric fighters are quite as versatile and capable as any starfighter ever created. It's just that they're limited to atmospheres and specific types of atmospheres to boot, where a 0G fighter can go into atmosphere and non-atmosphere in various functions and crosses the needs to reduce the amount of secondary machinery. So, if you're a defending world and you're not with intentions of defending your space, having atmospheric fighters is a good thing, and it's a cheap thing, and it's still viable in the Battletech universe. It's just that it's limited to your world. You can't go beyond your world with your air fighter and defend it, or to engage in activity on an adjacent, say, the moon, or an adjacent planet within your system. Not without a lot of extra resources and lift capacity and support. So the mech itself is this, I call it the result of a lot of people looking to make some impressive stance, and this movement towards a number of types of technologies that lended itself to creation for this thing in the first place. If you didn't have the Mechwarrior bundle, this device that allows you to power the muscles, if you will, to allow it to function, to move, to mimic the human form, you wouldn't have they wouldn't design it in the first place. You do not need Mechwarrior bundles to operate a tank. Tanks use servos and gears and good old hard crafted technology that's been around for 1,000 years by this point. The geopolitical standpoint, the hegemony is isolated. So what it makes it a powerhouse, what gives it its dominance over its neighbors, is its advancements in technology, its ability to outproduce its neighbors, to outshine its neighbors. They're all playing keeping up with the Joneses. House Karita and Lau and Devon and Steiner, etc., are all keeping up with House Cameron, because Cameron retains the lead. And then they hold on to this technology as long as they can. They keep it safe, they keep it quiet, they keep it exclusive until that it's time to dole it out. And the other houses more or less stand by this. They allow it to happen because they know eventually they're going to get their hands on the same technology, and then they're going to run with it, and they're going to make their own developments. So we see this in our real world today, where the Western countries, the United States, Britain, Canada, France, spends gobs of monies on research, and then we see Eastern countries such as China and North Korea and others acquire that technology from us and build upon it. They do not have to do all the R&D and expense that we did to get to the technology development level in the first place. So it behooves us to stay ahead of them by coming up with the next great thing and the next improvement, the next refinement. So in part, this is a political thing. Why the Battlemech? The Battlemech is a political thing. It is a social geopolitical thing. It is a image thing, right? It's just this thing. Then there's the adaptability. And there's a lot of discussion and argument in those who have anything to knowledge of robot warfare in the first place. There's some distinct things to keep in mind here. When I look from our perspective of like the Pacific Rim movies, we see Battlemechs and Robomechs in Pacific Rim. And that's exactly why I always wondered why we never have seen a Battletech or Mechwarrior movie. The franchise is popular enough. The video games alone has opened it up to a wider range of fans than the tabletop games ever did. And so when I look at that perspective and I think, why hasn't we seen a movie? Well, I'll never have that answer. But when I see Pacific Rim, and there's a couple older movies too that were not very popular, and they were considered low budget, that mimic Battletech. When I look at how they choose to their pilots control the machines, I rail against it in part because I'm so wedded with the concept of how the Battlemechs are worked in Battletech. So the mech, your pilot sits in a chair, like a pilot seat of a fighter plane, with all the controls and everything and readouts and sensors and all that stuff that surrounds them like you would expect. The difference is they wear a helmet called a neural helmet. The helmet basically tunes the the machine's operations and balance to the pilot through neuron interface. So this is some pretty advanced technology. The only thing that would be more effective in my eyes would be the direct interface, where you would literally jack in all the Shadowrun or any one of the cybertech types, where we have a mechanic set of technology, electronics that's embedded in the pilot's mind and body physically, allowing an even more smoother interface. So you don't have these contacts, this thing that sits on your head that you have to wear on your head that has to be in contact with your skin, that's dealing with the neurons coming through your flesh and bone, but something that actually interacts directly with that particular system inside. Now, we will never know, and Battletech, had the Starleague not self-disintegrated, had the technology advances continued for another couple hundred years, we might have reached that level. We see some of that in how the clan elementals work. The clan elementals actually have a different kind of neural interface in some aspects, from my understanding. They have what almost looks like a tattoo, which is often confused as a tattoo, but it is a microfilament series of connections embedded into their skin, which then allow even more intimate connection with their suit of armor. So the pilots of the Battlemechs and the starfighters could easily reach that side of technology. So the Battlemech is constructed, and biggest part is because the Camerons in general and those people that are head of the hegemony at the time are going to, the HAF, are going to push for something that's going to stand out and awe and shock everybody else, because they need that edge. They need to retain that we are superior edge to their neighbors, because they're outnumbered, outgunned, more or less. Their neighbors combined are much more powerful, much more wealthier than hegemony forces are, and they need to maintain that lead, that edge. So we have this economic and political and social reasons for developing something that's outside the box, something that's not the tank. At 20 tons, the smallest. Now there are some 10-ton and 15-ton protomechs and things like this, but the standard given quo is 20 to 100-ton range, and it's just like tanks. The tanks can run between 15 and 100 tons, and then there's been some attempts to make things bigger than 100 tons, but there's a wall, there's a ceiling to functionality. The tanks are just too damn slow. The ground won't support them. The mechs are too damn slow. The ground won't support them. The technology needed, to make such a bigger, even more powerful, we won't see something like the Leviathans from 40K, because it's not in the Battlemech universe is Bible. That is not going to be considered acceptable. So we have a range, we have a limit, and of how big and how much we can pile onto these things at the moment. And Battletech is not a game of technology. Although it's a science fiction type game, and Mechwarrior is a science fiction world, sci-fi fantasy setting, it is not technology driven. It's not Star Trek. So we're not going to see really radical breakthroughs in technology. That's kind of like Star Wars. Star Wars doesn't see a whole lot of technological advances. You do not see really fantastic technology in Star Wars on the scale that you do, say, Star Trek, because that's not the genre, that's not the flavor or the story. Okay, so what when we look at the mechanics, the differences, the tanks are cheaper to make, can be still mass produced by just about any power with significant resources. So even the periphery and small houses have the ability to manufacture tanks in some variant. Tanks can mount pretty much any weapon system created. What they can't do is be awe-inspiring. They can't tower over their foes. They also are not as nimble as a mech is reported to be. These are not lumbering, articulated, slow-motion AT-ATs from Star Wars. These things can, a 20-ton mech with the right kind of infrastructure can run upwards of 100 kilometers an hour and not tear itself apart, destroy everything around it in the process, kill its pilot from just beating him to death inside that cockpit. The fact that they can climb. A tank cannot climb a wall. A mech can. And you can put appendages on. You can add certain types of mechs can have devices attached to their limbs to allow them to function in better climb mode. So they can literally scale the outside of a cliff or scale the side of a building in the right circumstances. You can't do that with a tank. A tank is limited by its terrain, much more limited than a legged mech will be. Yes, the tank is a much more stable platform. I will grant you that. There's far less technology, far less equipment needed to keep that tank level and its system functioning, as opposed to all the actuators and power packs and heat sinks and all this other stuff that the mech requires to move. But the mech, on the other hand, can transition from a flat ground surface to water, can go underwater because they're a sealed system. They're this sets them apart from the fact they have a fusion engine sets them apart from industrial mechs, which many of those run off internal combustion engines still. So they're not able to function underwater like a mech can, nor can they function in outer space. You can take a mech outside of a ship and, in theory, have a battle on the outside of the ship's large enough, you can have a battle on the hull. You can take them into zero gravity, though. They function poorly in zero gravity because they don't have any kind of thrusters or any. They're not aerospace fighters. They're not designed to function in free fall zero with zero G. But if they're magnetized to the hull of the ship, they can still function, but much more delicately. The same goes with a airless atmosphere. You can go onto a surface of a moon or a planet. You go to a planet where the atmosphere is completely hostile to human beings because the mechs are all self-contained. They have their own environmental systems inside that function. Of course, they're all at greater risk of failure and issues like this. Certain tanks can also have pressurized hulls, can also have environmental systems. Higher tech level tanks absolutely can still function in zero G, can still function in no atmosphere or very poor atmospheres. Absolutely. The mech has the ability to maneuver itself better than a tank. In the prospect that a tank has to weave in and out of trees where the mech can literally push the trees out of the way if they're small enough. Well, I guess a tank can do that too, but not on the scale that the mech can. The mech only takes one pilot. Then there are some derivatives early in the game system that suggest that there's actually two seats, that most mechs carry the ability to carry a pilot and a passenger or a co-pilot, but this is not true. It's said over and over again in the books, the stories, and in adjacent source books and game materials that comes out, that the cockpits, even the largest mechs, are fairly cramped and that there's not a lot of extra space within. You have a few designs like the Cyclops, the Battlemechs, that do have jump seats in them. Some of the big mechs have enough space to have a hold-up seat. So in theory, you could have a spare person in there, absolutely necessary, but it's not conducive to ultimate function. Where a tank needs a crew of 2 or more, usually 3 to 5, depending on the size of the tank and its function. So you need 2 to 3 times more combat personnel to operate that machine. Now, the technical aspect of it, the support techs, you need a couple techs to support the tank, just like you need a couple of techs to support a mech. So that's kind of a weak argument on its own merit. The variety of weapon carried is a push. The bigger the mech, the more shit it can carry. The bigger the tank, the more weapons it can carry. I mean, it's a no given. Now, the mech sits higher. Majority of these mechs sit much higher. They tower above everything else, which means they have a much wider range of strike capability than a tank. The downside is they tower around everything around them. This is the same thing with the tanks. The tanks are going to have the advantage of being lower to the ground, more profile, be a little harder to hit, etc., etc. The mechs, because they're cutting edge, tend to carry better technology, better equipment, better sighting and tactical computers and things like this, make it easier for them to hit their opponents. Yet most advanced tanks can all do the same thing, right? So in truth, at the end of the day, when we look at the differences of all these things, that the mech is awe-inspiring and impressive, and that probably by itself has pushed it to the forefront of modern conflict in the Battletech universe more than anything else. Because you can mass produce tanks far faster than you can Battlemechs. You can repair them easier. You can scavenge parts better because there's more of them. It's easier to train somebody to operate a tank. Not everybody has to be able to understand the entire function that's going on here like you would in a Battlemech. The Battlemech pilot is not unlike that of a fighter pilot. It takes lots of periods of time. That's one of those things why, like I said, in the when I was trying to did my ham-fisted attempt at talking about the Grey Death Legion and Grayson Carlisle, the fact that he is a young man, he started when he was about 10 years old and began the long process of becoming not just a good pilot, a mech pilot, but to be a superb one. And along with that, all the other tactics and material that needs to go with this in order for him to be the outstanding character that he becomes. So, when we talk about why the Battlemech, well, that's what makes the game, right? There are a lot of distinct advantages over this machine device versus the regular conventional machines of warfare. But once they started down this path, once the Intersphere leadership started and was impressed and felt more and more driven to embrace this technology, once you go down that rabbit hole, it's hard to climb back out. And in this case, they never did. One of the things that sets the Battletech universe, I use that term a lot. I'm trying to avoid that kind of washed out meme of what's this, that, and the other thing. What sets this game apart from other games? Well, it's the flavor and the spirit and the concept. And you know that as well as anybody else. Any gamer worth their salt understands this is what the attraction is, why one game system attracts a certain type of people or this group of people, and another one attracts those kinds of people, and why we can have so many multiple systems. Look at our fantasy role-playing game systems. Good Lord. What do we got? 30 different types of OSRs out there and new systems that are pretty much McDonald's. They all got their version of the quarter pounder. They all got their version of the fries. It's just a different bit of flavor. The settings is what really sets them apart from each other, mechanically speaking. It is the truth in that convention. So the premise for the game is that mankind has long ago developed the technology to take them to space, to lead them to a grand era, to develop and to push the boundaries of known science and technology to a certain point. Once mankind gets out into space and becomes pretty big and unwieldy, this Terran alliance suddenly disintegrates, and the predecessors of many of the current houses and minor houses and stuff basically go to war with each other. And some of this war is all out to the teeth. They use these vast fleets of starships to just pummel planets into submission. And the conflict is horrible. And on a grand scheme, they fling nuclear bombs around like we throw tomahawk missiles around today. It's just detrimental to everything. Eventually, common sense starts to sink in, and other mindsets start to change a little bit. And the Camerons managed to get enough people to sign the Concord to create the Star League. And so, for the better part of 300 years, the Star League is the peak of human advancement, technology, social, economics, etc., etc. And even during the 300 odd years of the Star League, we have the non-end and conflict of and war, because humans are humans, and I don't know what it is about the human psyche and mindset that insists on having to have this, where we have to impose our physical might or impose our will on others who don't agree with what we want and how we envision the world. So the Star League, almost as soon as signed the concords and agreements, the great houses decide that the Star Lord decides that the periphery states who didn't agree need to come into the house. They need to join up. They need to become part of the human sphere. Because why? Because we just can't have them living their giving examples of freedom and liberty and doing what they want. That's just the gist of it. So they turned this vast industrial war machine and in the industrial war, industrial complex loose on it and start the reunification wars, which is a misnomer by itself because they were never unified in the first place. We're going to unify you whether you want it or not. Welcome to the Star League. And once that started to wrap down, starts to conclude, they pretty much conquered the periphery. What's worth conquering, anything beyond the periphery, are literally little, frontier settlements and bandit states that are so tiny and they're just not worth. They're not cost effective for the sheer volume of man, material, and resources the Star League can muster to try to bring them on the heel. And eventually, they would still push out there further and further and further. Instead, they fall apart inside, which leads us to the Succession Wars. And the first Succession War, the most devastating, it trumped anything in the Age of War in the years before the Star League. By once it was determined that the Star League you couldn't salvage the Star League, and Alexander Kerensky took the bulk of the Star League forces and his exodus, the houses laid into each other with a vengeance. All these centuries of pent up anger and aggression and misunderstandings and intentional understandings and this human need to conquer everything sets in. And it damn near destroys everything. It reduces the technical base extreme. This is why tanks, once again, are much more viable, because tanks can be produced in much lower technology brackets. You may not have tanks that can have fusion engines, but you can still build them with internal combustion engines. They still have autocannons. They can still have lasers. They can still have all this technology. They just may not be as good as what their predecessors were 100 years before. But you can still mass produce them. On the other hand, the industry to manufacture these highly sophisticated mechs and all their components is devastated. So there's only a handful of factories left in the inner sphere that can produce these things in any kind of numbers, and none of them are in significant numbers. The ability to field brand new armies on a large scale from the industrial complex is nearly wiped out by the second Succession. We see the same thing happen with the Navy. The Star League era warships and technology is brutalized. Shipyards are destroyed, factories are destroyed, the populations that know how to function, the technicians, the scientists, the people who learn how to run them and develop them and build them are vaporized in nuclear strikes and attacks and purges, and the list goes on and on. If I can't have it, you can't have it mindset. So we'll just deny it to everybody, and at the end of the day, we're cutting off our nose in spite of ourselves. So it gets to the point where all the warships disappear from the inner sphere. All that's left is a handful of factories that can produce barely produce maybe a dozen or 2 dozen jump ships a year, which is wholly inadequate for replacing just regular losses. Ships, things age, wear out. This is another thing that links back to what I was trying to say in my previous video on Decision of Thunder Rift. One of the things is that, like Grayson Death Carlisle was the inheritor of a family tradition, and his father's mech would eventually have been his mech, because it's at the point of the conflict, the year that this breaks loose, that this story takes place, and that our hero becomes the hero that he is. It is the early 31st century. I'm sure I've got, I just said the year here somewhere. Yeah, here's the prologue. 10,000 years of organized warfare has accumulated a fabrication of arms and armor mobility strength called the Battlemech. Standing 12 meters tall, the typical mech is vaguely humanoid, an armored giant of myth legend come to life. The slightest weighs 20 tons, the heaviest 75 or more. Even the smallest mech bristles with lasers, particle cannons, long and short-range missiles. Mech is a striding, thundering death for any unarmored army crazy enough to stand and fight, and a formidable foe even for heavily armored conventional units. Traditional military tactics thought to hold the best way to fight a mech is to send in another mech, preferably one bigger, stronger, and more heavily armored. When matched, monster machines can pound away at one another for hours, each waiting for that one fatal mistake by its opponent. Each waiting for that inevitable critical failure, a nerve machine and an instant lapse in guard tactics will leave it way open for a fatal strike. Same kind of military balance exists between the 5 major houses, successor states of the early 31st century, as they were amongst themselves for the control of known space. Yeah. So after years of centuries of warfare, no clear gains have been made by any single house, no fatal fall uncovered, wars continue the giant struggle among the ruins of once had been a proud galactic civilization. Like well-matched Battlemechs, the forces seem too evenly balanced for anyone to gain a vital, decisive edge. But the powers behind the war understand the maximum of the world is war itself, that cannot be won by force of arms, can also be achieved by cunning, deceit, or by concealed blades slipped through the enemy's back. Nikolai Aristobulus, Terrorist Balance, a story of the Succession War. And I'm still trying to remember what year this is. I know the year is in here somewhere. That's what happens when I write notes, because my notes don't have enough. My notes don't have enough information on what it was. When I want it. 3032. So the year is 3032. 1,020 years from today, more or less. And the succession wars have ground the secession states to a pace. The technology is, a lot of it is lost tech. It's only held together by spit and boiling water and duct tape and audacity, and people hand down the technology to how to repair something from generation to generation, just like they hand down the machinery itself. So the Battlemech is still the king of the battlefield. Why the mech? Because. Why does humans do anything that we do? Because. Why do we do this, that, and the other thing? It's because it's there. Till next time, this is Rick, and this is your seat at the table, Battlemech Perspective.